So we've got about 3 minutes, we'll get started. One thing with this session, so there's 2 sessions this morning that are double length and there's 2 that are single length. So at 9:45, we'll take a 15-minute break because it's going to be a loud roar in the hallway. That way, if some of you want to leave and go to another session, that's fine. If you want to stay here, you got something off topic or whatever, or maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of the bonus content I've got. But we will take a break at 9:45 just to kind of respect the single length sessions. And some people may want to come in if some people leave. I think it looks like it's going to be a fairly full session. So it looks like, okay. Thought they'd shut the doors. Before I get started, who in this room does not know who I am? Okay, it looks like I've done a pretty good job, but I do need to cover my bio slide then. So my blog, you can, of course, my name is Mike Robbins, and an alias to get to my blog, I didn't bring any cards this year. I've given out like thousands of cards. Probably most people here have gotten one from me in the past that have been here in the past. But my initials are MR like Mr., so you can just go to mrpowershell.com. So everybody can remember that. And my user group is a Mississippi PowerShell user group, so the state abbreviation is MS. So you can go to mspowershell.com to get to the user group. So just remember Miss and Mr. PowerShell. Okay, I think it's close enough. We've got 1 minute at this point. I want to thank whoever gave me the batteries for my presentation remote, because it's one of those anxiety things that when I first get started presenting, I walk around a little bit, so I'm not strapped to the podium, and I can advance my slides without having to be at the computer. So a little bit about me. I'm Mike F. Robbins. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been an MVP for like 5 years. Leader and co-founder of the Mississippi PowerShell user group. I actually came up with the idea for the PowerShell conference book and organized it. And then Jeff Hicks, he was going to write a chapter. He came on board, started bossing people around. I said, "Ooh, you sound like a good editor." So he volunteered himself. And then Michael Lombardi, he became an editor. He was doing a lot of the helping us with the collaboration on GitHub. He wrote a chapter and did a lot of editing. So that project is not a burden on one person every year. Jeff didn't want to take it over, and I told Michael, I said, "It's your turn. You're the project lead next year, but the deal is you have to find somebody else to turn it over to the next year." So that way it'll move from person to person, but the person we choose will be part of the project, so they'll be familiar with the process. So you're not here to know about that. I've written some other books, won the scripting games. You're not here to learn about me, but you can find out more at mikefrobbins.com, but an alias is mrpowershell.com. It goes to the same site. So I've got a few questions for the audience. How many IT pros do we have in the room? Okay, and you may fall under, since we're all kind of in the DevOps role now, you may be more than one role. How many developers? Okay, good. It looks like we've got a good mix of people. How many people are using unit testing today? Okay, that's something that everybody should be doing. What about source control? Great. How many people are using VS Code? That's really good too. Until recently, last year I presented with the ISE, and I had sad Joey in here because when you use the ISE, it makes Joey sad, but I decided to take his picture out because I didn't ask him if I could use it. So how many people are still using the ISE? Okay. I rebuilt my machine in March, and I only use ISE when it's on steroids, if you know what I mean. So I use ISE steroids. And I purposely did not put the ISE steroids module back on my machine, so I would hate using the ISE. So I've only opened the ISE one time to find out if something worked differently since March. And how many people are using PowerShell Core? Okay. And I'm sure everybody here knows, but I try not to make assumptions because I'm bad about, I'll do things numerous times, and then I'll assume that other people know everything I know, and that's kind of a bad habit to get into. But of course, PowerShell Core installs side-by-side on Windows-based systems. you can install it at least on your workstation and start testing the code you're writing to make sure it runs in both. And that's what I do. I don't have PowerShell Core in production at all. And at least right now, I don't have plans to put it in production. But I try to do things as efficiently as possible. So I do want to test all my code moving forward in PowerShell Core. So when we get to that point, I don't have to go rewrite everything. It's kind of like if you're using get WMI object, you should be using get cmdlet. How many PowerShell experts do we have in the room? So it sounds like you guys are volunteering to write a chapter in the new PowerShell conference book, and I expect you to be up here presenting next year. So the information, we'll talk about performance counters. We'll talk about performance counter sets, names, the top 10 performance counters, and that's what this session is geared around. There's a Microsoft article that lists the top 10 performance counters for Windows-based systems and their recommended values. And that is the entire session. We'll talk about querying performance counters, creating a reusable tool, automating the validation, Pester, validation test, testing collections with Pester. We'll talk about advanced validation test and more. So the reason I came up with this topic is the results of the get counter commandlet are not very object-oriented. This is actually what they look like. And who can figure that out? And get counter was actually added in PowerShell 2. I wasn't sure if it was in version 1, but I had a 2008 non-R2 machine on my VM on my machine. So yesterday morning, I booted it up. I added the Windows PowerShell feature, which is how you got PowerShell 1 to find out if it was in PowerShell 1, and it is not. So all the code and everything, we're going to start the demo now. I just have a couple of resource slides at the end, so that's all the PowerPoint. I've always said you don't learn PowerShell by looking at PowerPoint. But the code and everything is on GitHub already. All my presentations, even the one from last year, everything I do that I can share is on GitHub. And so the presentations are all in the same repository. If you don't believe I've refactored my demo major this week, just look at the commits on GitHub. So I normally get up at 5 a.m. in Central Time, which is 3 here, so you can imagine. I talked to Don about it last night, and he said, stop it. He said, don't touch your demo again. So what did I do? I got up this morning and refactored the demo. You know, I'm kind of like a kid, you know, that, and I was telling somebody at breakfast this morning, it's like you could say, don't touch this, and then that's the only thing the kids can see. They have tunnel vision to touching that. But if you never said anything, then they would never touch it. So Don said, don't do it, so I did it. Okay, so is this large enough for everybody? Great. If it's any larger, it would be hard to present. So I do like the ISE theme. I think I've already run some of this, but I like using throw to make sure I don't run the entire script. Some people use break, but break doesn't always break because it's designed to break out of a loop. I like changing the errors to yellow, but that doesn't work for all the errors. You'll see that some errors it works for, but I know Joel Bennett and me were talking about this. There's different type of errors that does not change. So that's something I need to submit a bug about. So I just need to make sure I've run some of this prep for the demo, and we'll just clear the screen too. And I guess that's the only thing about collapsing my regions. I'm not sure about the hotkey for it. So this demo environment, it's Windows 10 version 1809 on this VM. I've got a domain controller running Windows Server 2019 Server Core installation. Performance counter's been there since PowerShell 2, so you don't need anything that new. It can be older, but I wanted to show you that this would run on the latest version of Windows as well. So the execution policy, if you want to run some of these demos, it needs to be remote signed or less on the machine you're running the commands from. So like on my workstation. So I've already modified that. I tried to have something in this demo for everybody, so the beginning is going to be not super advanced, but we'll build up to that. So the beginning will be like, I know all that for the experts, And then the end will be, that's over my head for anybody who's possibly been here for their first year. One thing you can do in VS Code, there's actually an extension, and let's see what the name of it is. So it's called Shell Launcher. You can hit Control-Shift-T. You can launch PowerShell Core. And then you can split the terminal. And that's not the cool part. So the cool part is I can be running PowerShell Core. Oh, come on. And Windows PowerShell side by side in the same copy of VS Code. So I can run my commands right there and test them in both. And what I want to show you with that is actually this command. I want to show you that most of the demo is in Windows PowerShell because we're using get counter, which does not exist in PowerShell Core. So you'll see there's only 2 commands, even though the module does exist. So the bad thing about this is if you use a require statement and you tell it you need the module, well, the module's there, so it'll pass that validation. But the module is different. It's missing 3 commands. It's missing all the counter ones. And the only thing I can come up with is since it was added in PowerShell 2, they're using WMI, like get WMI object, which doesn't exist in PowerShell Core. So, of course, with that, and you guys probably already know this, that if I run this command here, that it will error out, and if I run it here, it will run. Now, what you can do, and that's not what I wanted. Who hates touchpads? I actually have a mouse, but on this slanted surface, it would be almost impossible. So PowerShell Core, of course, get counter didn't work. You can get those so I think it was a % processor time. You can get the information from WMI, but with the getSim instance commandlet. And of course, you can do it down level in the Windows PowerShell, so I won't show you that one just for time. The other thing you could do, and this will work in both as well, but I'll show it to you in PowerShell Core. You could just go straight to the .NET framework. So if you really wanted to, you could write your own get counter, and you could either use the .NET framework, which is what I would recommend, or you could use getSim instance instead of get counter. And you can do some more advanced things with that. So if you actually want to get it, the processor time continuously, you could do that. And then, just to test it over in Windows PowerShell. And that is erroring because we didn't run part of the demo. So we didn't define our variable that we were trying to use. It's one of the bad things about doing a scripted demo. If you do skip something, you're in trouble. So that's the processor time in PowerShell Core, Windows PowerShell. So this can be done in PowerShell Core, just not the way I'm doing it for most of the demo. If you wanted something similar to the way that getCounter looks, you could do write a command. Now getCounter is a hot mess, so I don't recommend doing this. But if you're dead set on doing it anyway, then this is how you would do it. So you can see that I actually returned the reason I say it's a hot mess is you've got the machine name, you've got the category, you've got the instance, and you've got the counter all jumbled up into one thing. And that's why I also say it's not a real object-oriented. And these are kind of the problems. What I'm covering now is the problems I ran into when I tried to write some sort of performance validation. It's like I've got this commandlet that outputs crap, and I need object-oriented format. So how do I get that? So, normally you want a performance baseline. That's best case. I've got a performance baseline, and the scenario with this I didn't cover yet, but we're actually just getting to the introduction portion. You leave work on Friday, and this is written in the book too. You leave work on Friday, everything's great. Woohoo! Great weekend, maybe it's payday weekend. You come in on Monday, people are running around like their hair's on fire. When's the system going to be up? And you're like, I don't have any notifications, system's up. It's like the perception is the system is down because the performance is so bad they can't even get logged in. I've got 50,000 servers, and I'm exaggerating. Where is the needle in the haystack? People are at your door, the CEO's there, when's it going to be up? And you haven't even logged into your computer yet. So now, the reason that people generally don't do performance baselines is nobody cares about infrastructure. That's the bottom line. I'm an infrastructure guy. I've been an infrastructure guy since 1994. Nobody cares about infrastructure. You know when they care about it? When there's a problem. It's kind of like us, and we're all guilty of this. If there's a power outlet somewhere, do you really worry about the infrastructure behind that to deliver power to it? You don't. When do you worry about it? When you plug into it and it doesn't work. It's kind of like water. You don't worry about how water gets there. When you turn on the faucet and it don't work, then you care. And the other infrastructure, I'm sure, I don't know about the roads around here because I haven't driven here, but the roads where I live at, you care about the infrastructure when you have all these potholes in the road. So the top 10 performance counters, this is a list of them. This is also a link to the blog article where this is referenced on Microsoft to give you the recommended values. Now, you kind of have to take this with a grain of salt because maybe it's normal for your SQL server to have poor performance with disk, for example, because maybe when it does transaction log backups, it's got poor performance. So you may be outside these specs, and that may be normal for your system. That's why it's best to have a baseline. But this kind of gives you an idea because if your system is outside these values, then you probably have a problem that's been going on for a period of time, and you really just haven't addressed it. Maybe you need to get an all SSD SAN or something. So just talk a little bit about performance counters. So, and I've already covered that. You can find some baseline information on the internet. So I already told you that too. The reason I chose this topic is because Get Counter doesn't produce very object-oriented friendly output. So if you don't know what performance counters you want to query, you have to find them somehow. And you can see there's a couple of things commented out here. I'm not going to run them, but this is for somebody that might be not an expert that might see this. No matter how much, and it's actually for the experts too, it's kind of a funny joke, that experts are the world's worst about using get help because they think they already know everything, so they make assumptions, and they try to shortcut the process, and then they find out, oh, well, this command doesn't really work the way I thought it did. About 30 minutes in, then they decide to break out get help or search the internet for the solution. When if they would have just ran get help to start with, they would have saved themselves a lot of trouble. So no matter how much you think you know, just go ahead and use get help. So one thing I do is, and I am going to run this command. This is, a lot of times when I want to know how to use a command, this is what I run. I just want something really quick and concise. That all I want to know the syntax for it. So I want to see the parameter sets, and a lot of people, even experts, don't understand what all this little stuff means, but I can actually give it multiple performance counters. I can give it multiple computer names. So that means I can query all 10 performance counters at one time without having to query them individually. And I can see that with the syntax. So it's like very abbreviated, hey, that's how it works. I can see it, that, you guys should know this, but it accepts an array of strings, so it accepts more than one value. And I won't beat a dead horse to death at this point. But I use that command constantly. Okay, let's talk about the type of objects that getCounter produces. I'm going to run all three of these at one time because I want all my output right together. Because I want you to see, getCounter is actually kind of like a Swiss Army knife, because depending on what parameter set and how you use those parameter sets, you can actually get three different distinct types of objects from it. So the list set parameter, it does just what it says. It lists the sets. It gives you the categories, is what I like to call it. Well, and no, I told you wrong. So it actually gives you everything. But what it does, it gives you, what I'm going to do here, let me make sure it's not in the demo. Yeah. I think I have this later in the demo, but what I prefer is to pipe things to select object and grab the first property so that I'm not overwhelmed by the amount of data it returns. It might help. Yeah. Like I said, when you do live demos, and that's why even somebody that's been doing PowerShell as long as I have, you're not going to get everything perfect, so don't get a bunch of anxiety about having errors. But you can see all the different properties that it has, and you can also see the values, which is what I like, instead of piping it to get member. Now, one thing I will tell you, and no, I won't tell you because it's in the demo. Okay, so let's, instead of using this, let's use the mouse. So you can pipe to get member, you get all the properties there, and that's not a bad idea. You guys should know this, so we're going to run through this really quick. The number of properties, we got 7 properties that's there, so you don't have 50 million properties. That's my point of this. So getCounter, it kind of shoves a bunch of stuff into the few properties you get, which is why I don't like it. But sometimes you have to make the square peg fit in the round hole anyway. So, and there's the command I was going to show you, so I've already showed you that. And you might want to say property star just to make sure you get all the properties, but the thing is, list set actually returns all the properties by default, so you don't have to do that. Who knows the difference in piping something to select object property star and format list property star? It does, but there's something more important than that. Something more important than that. Actually, you don't. And that's my point. So I just ran property star with format list, and look at how many properties I got for my profile. I got 1 item. Yes, you're right. So if I run select object, it gives me all of them without having to add the force parameter to format list. So I'll get the same thing if I add force. But who remembers to add force, to start with? So that's why I pipe to select object property star and grab the first one instead of using format list. Because format list can hide properties, and select object property star does not. So I have something for you when we do the break for the answer, for the right answer. So the counter set name gives you the categories, as I said earlier. And that's how you find the performance counters. Well, the categories for the performance counters, it's the first step. What I recommend is go ahead and sort these because there's a lot of them. So that'll give you a sorted list of all the different categories for performance counters. So maybe I want to find all the ones that are related to disk. I want to write some checks for disk-related performance counters. So I can add a value to list set instead of just saying everything. And when I run that, I can see what my option, these are my categories I can find performance counters for. And even So I've been blogging on PowerShell since 2009, so I know I've been doing PowerShell more than 10 years, and a lot of the way this commandlet works was very foreign to me because nothing else works this way. Things work similar, but you will understand what I mean here in a few minutes. So one thing I want to point out here is the format for the counters is this format. So it's actually / computer name, the counter set name, which is what I was calling the category, the instance, and then the counter name. Now the computer name is optional. There's also a computer name parameter. And if you use this computer name, it doesn't use the computer name parameter. But if you don't use this, then you have the ability to use the computer name parameter. And I think that's what the next line says. Don't spoil my demo. Did you raise your hand when I asked for PowerShell experts? No, actually, that was a compliment. So I want to find the one for a physical disk, the performance counters for a physical disk. Now I have drilled down to the point where I can see the actual performance counter names. But notice all those have star for the instance. Guess what? When I look at pass, it gives me the same thing as counter. I'll just run counter again so you can see that. So if I run get counter list set physical disk, then I get back to kind of everything. But what I want you to notice with this, so pass, notice so everything is like, it looks like a collection, but it's not. And counter is exactly the same thing. But then there's a pass with instances where you can get all the different instances for every counter. Like I said, a hot mess. We may have run some of this. Yeah, so we're there. So what I'll do here, I'll just compare the the counter and the paths property, and you can see there's actually no difference. So I've already told you that, but that just kind of proves it. I use compare object for that. So you might say why, but the reason is counter is actually an alias property to pass. And what I figured out at first, I was like, well, why would you do that? So anybody who writes functions know that on your parameters, on your input parameters, you can set an alias for the parameter so that you can accept pipeline input by that alias name, if you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, then you need to go watch my video from last year. Well, what they've done here, they've kind of done that backwards. So they're outputting the property as two different names so they can pipe this to other commandlets that accept either a pass or a counter parameter without having to add the alias on the other end. Yes. And actually, it would be by property name. Because it's the property name, I don't like the term by value. Actually, I hate it. Because by value, what it really is, and I mentioned this last year as well, it's actually by type. So like by string. Somebody asked me last year in my session, couldn't they just name it by type? And I'm like, yeah, that would be, it's one of those common sense. We were talking about common sense before the demo. If anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any point. So this looks like both of these commands here, they look pretty normal, don't they? So I could filter I could filter the counter property where it's like Q or the path property. And since counter and path are the same, I should get the same results on these, right? So I run this and like, I don't see Q in those, do y'all? So I tried the other one. I don't see Q in those either. So what's the deal here? You'll never figure this out. I'll just tell you. So if you run count, it's because it's not an array or a list. It's all jumbled into one. All that thing you see is one item. So all of those, it has Q somewhere in the whole thing, so it returns everything. Who would write a command like that? So, but what you have to do is grab the counter property first, and then you have them. So it's kind of like the way in PowerShell 3 the automatic for each works. So I'm kind of using the automatic for each to trick it. So then I can run the same command after I get the counter and then pipe it to where object. And then it works as expected. Yeah. Then I have 4, not 1. Now, I will tell you, I actually contacted Steve Lee from the PowerShell team about this. I contacted him in public on Twitter, and props to Steve because he just admitted, I mean, he was as honest as he could be. He said, I have no idea who wrote that. He said, but evidently they didn't know what they were doing. That's the gist of it. You can look at the tweet. He said, and there's more to come. This is actually not the specific thing. The thing we talked about is to come. But he said, evidently they didn't know what they were doing. So my guess is the engineer that wrote this is no longer with Microsoft. If they are, then they might want to consider to come to the PowerShell Summit next year.
I was saying this is what happens when a developer writes something for
And
infrastructure.
the only bad thing is it would be really bad if Jeffrey Snover wrote this, you know. So, but
He would go back and fix it.
yeah, he probably would. So you'll notice you actually get some default information. All I did was run get counter, and I get some information. Now, do you really like this output? So you got 2 properties. That's it. You got timestamp, which is the date time. You got counter samples, which has got all your data jumbled up together, and then you have a value with all that. Yeah. Now you know why I wanted to talk about this. So, because normally if I said, hey, we're going to talk about get counter, you'd be like, oh, that's 101 stuff, you know? Who would want to talk about that? Guess what? When you look at the properties, you got 3 properties. That's it. All that data we saw, and you got 3 properties. You got counter samples, you got timestamp, and you got readings. That's it. And one of those is unusable. Say that again? Let's see. I'm really not sure, to be honest with you. Oh, you're talking about the object type. That's what you're talking about. So yes. So yeah, so let me show you what these properties are, because yeah, you can drill down to those properties. So the time, I'll start with the timestamp because it's easy. It's a date time. So what you would expect. So if we look at counter samples, so now we're starting to get into something that looks usable. So we drill down into those properties, and you've actually got properties of the properties, you might say. Take it, I'm not a developer. I'm an infrastructure guy. So what do I know? So I look at count. Now, don't be confused. We did have the count is the results. So we have 3 different results, even though we have 3 properties, but ignore the number of properties. That has nothing to do with the properties. So if I look at the type, it's a performance counter sample. and the other one was a set. So we had like a set, and now we've drilled down into the counter samples. But when you look at this, you have even more properties. So it's kind of like one of those little Russian dolls, you know, that you unwrap one level and you unwrap another level and another level. And with this one, every time you unwrap a level of that doll, you have multiple dolls, not just one smaller doll. So you can look at the different properties. Let me see if I can get a happy medium of input and output. So you can see you have the path, and then you have some other information below that. The readings property is the one I really want to talk about, because the ones I've showed you so far are actually decent, but the readings is not so decent. So it looks like I've got fairly the same information here, but not really. So if I look at the count of that, all that output I just showed you, guess what? It's one item. One item. That's it. Who would do that? Yeah, I'm not going to go there. And what type is it? It's actually a string. So yeah, you know how they say don't parse data in PowerShell? Yeah, you'll be parsing data. So evidently, my guess is, you know how everybody wants you to love Linux now? Well, somebody who has a Linux background wrote this. So you have to love this. So if you look at the path with instances, I've already kind of told you about this, but you can see all the different instances, not just a star. So you can see I've got a C drive, a D drive, a total. And I want to tell you a little quick story about the total. We're doing decent on time. Never look at total. Let me just tell you that. Not unless it's like maybe CPU or something like that. Never look at total for disk. Because a couple of years ago when I was here at the PowerShell Summit, I started getting phone calls, performance problems. And we have a vendor we bring in sometimes, so it's like the call was made, hey, let's just bring the vendor in, let them take a spot check. And they found a little bit of Mickey Mouse stuff, and things seemed to ease up a little bit, and then like the next day they were back in the same boat. Well, the problem was they were looking at, we had 2 storage area networks at that point. We had one in a RAID 6 and one in a RAID 10. And they were looking at the performance, the GUI performance metrics, and they had it set on total. So it was looking at the total for both SANs. Looked great. Well, guess what? The RAID 10 was performing so well that you couldn't see unless you drilled down to the RAID 6 that it was completely saturated. It was doing more IOPS all day, every day than the array was even capable of. So that's why I say don't get burnt by looking at total. So one thing you can do with that, so maybe you want to look at percent free disk space. So I can find the percent free disk space with these performance counters. And then, guess what? I have to use a regular expression to parse text to get what I need. So I actually want the instances. Those are the different instances. And this will come into play when we get to the Pester portion of this demo. So I can query that and notice that I only got C and D drive because I excluded total. There were a couple of other ones out there that weren't C and D. It was like the initial partitions you have for like BitLocker and different things that kind of get filtered out with get counter by default, but not really. And so we ran that one. So when you're looking at this view, you can see everything. You can see those 2 that don't have a drive letter, and you can also see the total and the C and D. This is actually a VM, yeah. Never do demos on your machine. I have so many network cards that I do have some issues because I have Hyper-V installed, I have Docker installed, I have Wireshark installed. So yeah, it's a nightmare. I'm a jack of all trades, so I have many tools. But a master of one, PowerShell. So I filtered out total, but I still have those other two in there. But that kind of gives you an idea that I want C and D is all I want to look at. That's the point of this. And I can see the values. The cook value is actually the percentage and the percentage of free space. So I have a lot of free space. So I can go back, I can see the logical disk ones. I can look at the counters for it. Okay, I want to query all of the logical disk counters. What I can do, this one that's highlighted now uses the command in two different ways in a one-liner. So what it does, it actually uses the list set parameter, and it grabs all the sets that you saw here when I outputted the previous command. And it pipes it to get counter, and this one actually uses the counter parameter. So I can run that, and I can query all those performance counters. What I found out when I kind of looked at it more is it'll bind without having to select the counter property. So even though all those are in like one item, it'll still work. And it's probably the way the pipeline input on the commandlet works. I have a feeling that this commandlet was written when they were trying to kind of figure things out. So you can do things, of course, you guys, and I guess I should not assume that you know this. So you can store the counter or counters in a variable and then just pipe that to it. Now I said max samples is 5. So it's going to query it every 1 second 5 times. So I can grab the performance counters multiple times. There's a samples interval parameter that defaults to 1 every 1 second. So, and if I wanted to query them all, it's the same sort of thing. So this is a sample interval parameter. So I want to query it every 2 seconds, and I want to do it 3 times, so it'll take 6 seconds. So it's going to pause, it's going to run it again. And one thing you could do, and I don't, so that means that we got about 5 minutes to the break. So there's no fire in the building. What you could do, and I refactored my demo so many times that I'm surprised I didn't get to this, but you could pipe this to a SQL Server database using some of the commandlets in the SQL Server module, and you could store this, and then you would have a baseline, and later you could compare it when you're having problems. And it's fairly easy to do that. I have not done that with these particular commands, but if you look at my blog, I actually store the DSC configuration. I convert it to a hash table, and then I store it as data in a database. And then I have a way to go extract it and use it as the configuration without storing the configuration in a file. So at least that would be a proof of concept that this is possible. You can also query these performance counters continuously. It will just keep doing it every 1 second until I tell it to stop. I actually forgot one day, and I minimized my VM because I got busy, and I left this running. So yeah, don't do that. Especially don't do that on a production system. It's kind of like back in the day, when you had OpenGL screensavers and you could have them on your servers, they wouldn't approve a new server because of performance problems. Just go fire up an OpenGL screensaver on it and let it run. I'm back to this one command, and I've kind of already spoiled this one, that you can actually query multiple computers. So you could query multiple computers continuously or with any of these other parameters if you wanted to. Now, who thinks, I know what I want to show you. So if you look at these parameters, and what's the next command? It's continuous and max samples. So you see max samples here and continuous. They're in the same parameter set. So what does that tell you? I can use them both together, right? You would be wrong. So when I run this command, we get an error. Yep, guess what it says? Sorry, Charlie, you can't use continuous and max samples with the same command. This is what I contacted Steve about. I'm like, that's the last straw. So, and his comment was, whoever wrote it did not know how to write parameter sets, and they used some sort of other validation. But it makes it very hard to especially for somebody that, even me, I mean, I won't say somebody who's not as familiar, but even somebody who is familiar with PowerShell and you're used to it working a consistent way, that you would expect these two things to be in different parameter sets. Because I would write production code and then bet my paycheck that this would work, but it does not work. I'd lose a paycheck. So if you ran this command, the sample interval can't be less than 1, which is the default. So this one, I'm going to store the results in a variable. Now, one thing that if you guys remember Ed Wilson, the scripting guy, I've seen him present a number of times. I think it was at a SQL Saturday in Atlanta in a PowerShell session that he presented. He said, if you're going to eat an elephant, only eat it once. And what he means by that is if you're going to query something, say off a remote server, maybe you want to get every property for not every user in Active Directory, but you want every property to work with, a subset, maybe 10, or maybe 100. Let's use 100. Store it in a variable if you're prototyping, and then work with the variable. Don't prototype and keep hitting the domain controllers and dragging it across the network because the network guy is going to come see you, because I know I am the network guy. So the results, they have exactly the same thing in the properties, the variable. So you can work your command so that you can get exactly the data you want, and then you're ready to query it from the domain controllers or from whatever you're querying. Oh, there's Mr. Snover. We speak of the devil. So, so I think on that note, we are gonna take a 15-minute break but I'm going to take this question first.
Is there any benefit to out variable over just saying $results equals and the whole type?
The benefit of using this way is you get the output and the output in the variable, versus doing it that way, you only get the output in the variable. Yeah. Definitely. I have seen when the out variable didn't give me exactly what I thought it was going to give me. But one of the main things to remember is when you use out variable, you don't put the $ in front of the variable name. And when you do it the other way, you do. We're going to pick this up with jobs, and then we'll do Pester and infrastructure testing for the last 45 minutes. But we are on our break now until 10, is it 10 o'clock? Yeah, until 10 o'clock. And we're doing this because 2 of the sessions are shorter lengths. So if anybody wants to leave and not hurt my feelings, even though you wouldn't hurt it anyway, this would be a good time to leave. If you've got anything that's off topic, then now would be a great time, or any questions you want to come up and ask that you didn't want to ask in front of everybody else. Okay, I think it's about time to get started again. I've got some bonus content that if we have extra time, we'll do that. I had somebody else asking about a question about that is specifically covered in the bonus content, but this slide deck and the code is already on GitHub, so it's pretty self-explanatory, that portion of it. So did anybody come in who was not in the first part of this session? Okay. Did anybody leave? So, so I don't see any hands, so nobody left.
There's a bottleneck in the men's restroom.
Oh, okay, there you go. So maybe we need a performance counter for the men's restroom. So you would think, well, see, the problem is there's a theater on the second floor, and you would think that maybe there would be restrooms outside the theater, but I guess they're inside the theater, because you could easily walk downstairs and go to the restroom. But I guess if you've paid, I guess, to come into the theater, they don't want you to leave and come back in, because you might buy 6 tickets, and one person walks out and brings 5 more people in. So now you can you can query performance counters as a job by running start job. You can do this with just about any command. But there's a problem it creates. So I'm going to run a job. I'm going to query it 10 times so you can see, even though I'm hitting F8, it doesn't look like it's changing, but it is changing. It'll finish here in a minute. Well, there we go. So our job is completed. So who's worked with jobs in PowerShell before? Okay. So jobs are kind of unique as well. And I went for years without the need for jobs. And just by the way, as a side note, I haven't blogged this yet, but I hate scheduled jobs. I like scheduled tasks. And I'll just tell you why real quick. I'll give you the 5-second version. Scheduled jobs, it stores the job definition under the user profile who created it. So if you have something that cleans up profiles and that person's no longer here, and it cleans up the profile, then your job's gone bye-bye. Where a scheduled task is stored in Windows, and it does not get deleted like that. So that's why I hate scheduled jobs. So you have this job somebody set up 10 years ago. It's been working great. You say, oh, we need to clean up those old profiles. You clean them up. Now you wonder, why aren't my jobs running? Well, you deleted them. So we'll receive the job. It looks like we've got the same results we were getting before. Notice we did use the keep parameter. The first time you don't use the keep parameter, guess what? Your results are gone. They're history. So if we run get member, and I'll just go ahead and run we have all our properties. We actually have a run space ID as well. But what I want you to notice, so most of us, we're guilty of just looking at this last name. And it looks like, I got the same kind of property. Yeah, everything's cool. Well, no, not really. The problem is, it's deserialized. And there's actually, there's some other commands you could pipe this command to, the get counter command, that won't accept a deserialized object. So keep that in mind. What about remote performance counters? So I want to query all the performance counters related to TCP/IPv4 on my domain controller. So I queried them all. What I want you to notice, and this is later in the demo, but I want to cover it right now. Well, actually it didn't do it. Now who thinks, notice that when I piped this, I did not put -counter computer name DC01, but I got the counters from DC01. Who thinks that this ran on the local computer? Who thinks I got the counters from the remote computer and actually checked them on the local? And I guess my question another way, do you think I need this? Do you think I need computer name DC01? And you're right, I don't. I thought I was going to trick you. The reason you don't is when you run this first portion of the command, notice it's got the computer name. So that's how it talks to the remote computer. Remember the syntax I talked about at the very beginning of this session? Otherwise, you would need to specify the computer name. So this will get you the same information. Now one thing, this does not use PowerShell remoting. So this is like the old style, the like DCOM or whatever, so it's probably going to be blocked by your network team because the firewall is not going to be open. It's not firewall friendly like PowerShell remoting. So I typically do not use computer name parameters with commandlets unless it's like invoke command, because I typically run all my commands within invoke command, so it goes to the remote machine over 5985 or 5986 if you're in Azure, and then runs the command locally and then gives me deserialized data back. So this is different ways to, this is kind of the same thing I just told you. So I'm using the computer name parameter here, and I can query the logical disk 50% free disk space on my domain controller. Believe it or not, normally domain controllers are less secure than normal servers because there's a lot more ports open up. So these type of commands will run on domain controllers by default when they won't run on other member servers. You would think a domain controller would be more secure, but it is less. It's just a side note. So what I did here is, and it's what I told you earlier, I used the computer name parameter here. I used the / computer name there. It's actually exactly the same. You get the same results. The difference is, and I'm not going to run this command because I've already told you this, the difference is with the first syntax, I can query multiple computer names. So maybe I will run that. And I know that because it accepts an array of strings for computer name. So do you know how most of us, we've written these functions to go out and get like disk info? We've written like get computer info to go out and get information from our systems, and we want free disk space and all that, and maybe we have something written into it that maybe a dashboard or something that gives us some sort of alert when there's a low disk space or something like that. Well, instead of writing that function, you can actually just use performance counters. So if I want to know if the computer has less than 15% disk space, no it does not, because it doesn't have that much on it. Does it have any drives with less than 75%? Yes, it does. So I just found out that my domain controller has a disk on it that has less than 75% disk space. So I can run that against all 1,000 servers and query the disk space and immediately get it without writing a super advanced function. And I guess the moral of the story here is don't reinvent the wheel, you know. If there's something that already does it, use it. You can do the same thing with all types of things, such as I can get the top 6 processes that are running on my local machine, but I could do this on any machine, like my SQL server, and of course SQL would be one of the top ones. So you don't have to write any custom code really to do that type of information. Well, the problem is they tell us not to parse data, but if you're going to use this command, you must love to parse data. So you'll write something similar to this to get usable output. The only reason I'm piping the format table is just to make it more readable for you guys. So I get nice output. This is what I would expect. I get the computer name. I get the object or category. I get the counter. I get the instance. I get the value. I get the timestamp. Object-oriented. Well, I wrote this. I was like, woohoo, you know. Just like it says right here. Luckily, the format of these results is the same for all performance counters, or at least I haven't run into one that's different. And then I came back and added, or so I thought. Because guess what? If I run get counter on the local machine, I want you to notice how many slashes are after the computer name. Just one. If I run it on a remote machine, guess how many slashes are after the computer name? Yeah. So then I had to refactor my regular expression. Fun stuff. Oh, no, actually, this is the same regular expression. You can notice it doesn't work because of the way I was doing it. I didn't refactor it. I decided to take a better approach. I wrote a command, a format command. So you can run, say, get counter, and you get this nasty output. Or you can pipe it to format Mr. Counter. Well, that would be because I have not loaded, I actually don't have the module with these on this machine, so I'm just going to cheat and load them into my, on my function drive. And maybe I don't have that one open. Format Mr. Counter. Okay, crisis averted. So now doesn't that look nice? So I can just take the output. And what that command does, I'm just going to show it to you briefly because I do want to get to the Pester stuff. We don't need to see the help, but there is help for it. So it actually splits on a slash, and it seems to work pretty well, but I use like a remove empty entries because you end up some empty entries because when you have the double slashes, you end up with empty entries in it. So then I just carved out the empty entries. So that way it doesn't matter how many slashes are in it. It was kind of a unique solution, but if you want to see more about that, just see the function. I believe I wrote a blog article. Well, no, that I can tell you, and I'll take your question real quick. Go ahead.
Say, what happened when you did the invoke command?
I'm going to get to that. You get a single slash to answer your question, but I do have it in the demo, which makes it easier, but then you have the other problem of the deserialized object if you want to reuse it with some of the other commands like import and export counter. You can't pipe a deserialized object to those unless you pipe it to it on the remote machine. You can't bring it back and pipe it. You can't win for losing. So now maybe you understand why I wanted to talk about this, because it's an uphill battle to use this to get something useful out of it. So now we're to creating a reusable tool. We don't need to run that command again. So the get Mr. top 10 counter function stores the top 10 performance counters in a hash table, and it queries the value for them. Let's see. And it's actually in the presentation folder, but let's just go ahead and run it. So again, you don't have to pipe this to format table. I'm just trying to make it look a little nicer for you guys. So that's kind of the output you get. And what I did, I actually, even though I'm querying the top 10 performance counters, I sorted it down to only the ones for the C drive to give you an idea of the type of output that you get. So in some of the Pester stuff, I actually needed I needed a function called convert to Mr. hash table, or it converts the output of a command to a hash table. So it takes like say a PS object or PS custom object, and you just pipe it to that command, and you end up with everything in a hash table. So like the computer name, you would have computer name, and then you would have the computer name property name as the kind of like the key value, and then the value for that you would have the actual computer name. And we'll get to that. I think I have an example in here that I actually added this morning. So there are comments in here. Oh, yeah, let me talk about this. So who wants to figure out if, like this value, does this really tell you anything? 99? Does that tell you anything? It tells you really nothing. I don't know if 99 is like good, that 99% free, or 99% used, or what. And I guess I could look at the performance counter name and kind of figure it out. But who wants to query all your servers and get data like that back? And then figure out if all of them are within acceptable ranges? Not me. So that's the reason to use Pester, is do all the kind of heavy lifting for you. And it's a form of infrastructure validation. So you need Pester. Pester is actually a behavioral-driven development framework for PowerShell. A lot of people say it's a TDD, a test-driven development, but if you look at the wiki, it's not. It's a behavioral-driven development. So there's a version of Pester that ships with Windows 10. It's an old, out-of-date version. They should have never shipped Pester with Windows, in my opinion, because now you got signature problems. So you have to run this command, skip publisher check, to be able to install another version. And you can actually delete the existing version, although I think it's owned by the trusted installer, so you have to take ownership, and then you have to give yourself rights, and then you have to delete it. But there's some commands that don't work properly, and I think it's some of the help commands, because you end up with two results when you try to get help for certain things, because there's like a space in one and there's not in the other, instead of getting the actual help. So that was my motivation for deleting the old one. But the newer syntax allows you to do like dash should instead of just saying should, which I like that syntax better. There's the link for the wiki to Pester. So validation test. So we're going to do a simple validation test. So we're going to run this against, it looks like the local machine, the C drive. We're going to verify that the current disk queue length, and Steve Moralski in his session, I don't know if anybody was in there, but he says this is like the 1990s way of doing things, you know, but hey, some of us have, if you have on-prem equipment, then this is the way you're going to be doing it. Or you're going to have some product that actually does this under the covers. So you can do this yourself, or you can pay for a product that does this for you. Now, if you're in a cloud, in a platform as a service or something like that environment, then you don't have this level of monitoring, and you have to monitor somewhere else. And that's cool, you know. That's the reason I sat through his session, because we are moving to the cloud. We've got certain things in Azure, and we actually have certain things in AWS. And each cloud is better at doing certain things. So me personally, even though like your boss probably says, I want one bill, tough luck, you know. That's what we have accountants for. They can pay the bill. The bill's not my problem. Performance is my problem. So we can see that, hey, the Pester test ran good. Now, who thinks this is a good Pester test? I would say, it's okay, you know. It's not the best, but at least it is a Pester test. So if you're writing Pester tests, you're 50% there. It's kind of like I tell people, ask them how their day's going at work, and they say, not so good or whatever, and I'm like, well, being here is 50% of the battle. But anyway, I would not write my code to query something in here. You really should break that out into, like, especially if you're writing a function, you don't want to write a whole function inside of your test. You want to break that out separately. You want to write things really as small as you can, almost kind of like microservices, because you might want to run the function separately than the test, but it can also get really complicated to troubleshoot and everything when you have all this code in these tests. And I'll show you a really good example of this. So testing collections with Pester. So I have a blog article that when I was at the MVP Summit a couple years ago, let's see, looks like I skipped down a little bit. We certainly don't want to skip that. I need to run these few commands here. Just make sure that we hadn't met, testing collections, that's where we were. It's one of these learning curves for VS Code. So I'm only going to show you a subset of the top 10 performance counters, and I'm going to show you the ones, we're going to use Pester with them. I have the entire command here, but there's some specific things you need to know about, and kind of all of them fall into these same categories with problems. So we're going to say, hey, we've got all our counters. We ran the get Mr. Top 10 counter function, and we stored the results in a variable. So we've eaten the elephant one time, like I was saying earlier, and now we're going to work with the results of the variable. And this is how I actually run my Pester test as well. So we're going to say now all we want to do is work with the current disk queue length. So these are the instances. So I'm going to grab the instances, and some of this stuff, it may look like I'm doing something really similar twice to be able to use test cases in Pester, but since I have the information in a variable, it's not like I'm having to go do a query and get the information and then go do a query and get the value. I actually have it all stored in a variable, and since the computer's really fast, then it's not that much overhead. So anyway, this is producing object-based output, but we don't need object-based output to be able to use test cases. And you can see so it's a PS custom object. So we're going to convert that to a hash table. So this is what I want to see. This is what I need for test cases. So what type of object do we have? We have a hash table, of course. So you could use like a for each loop for this, but you'd be writing a lot more code and it wouldn't be as efficient. Anyway, I don't think I finished my story. I had this really cool code, or so I thought, that I was going to present at, I think, a SQL Saturday. And I was showing it to Jim Truer, and it was a few weeks before I was going to be presenting. And he's like, oh yeah, he's like, there's this new feature we just added in Pester called test cases. That's what you need to use. So I wrote a blog article about test cases right when it came out, and it's like the neatest thing ever, but it's kind of hard to wrap your head around the test cases feature. But just go read the blog article if you want to know more about that particular feature. So now what I'm doing, so I'm getting the instances, putting them in a hash table, and then I'm actually iterating through the instances with test cases. So if I run this, so I ran it. So that way, I'm not writing the same code over and over, and I'm not iterating through it with a for each loop either. Test cases takes care of that for you. And it's about writing more efficient test in Pester. So validating that the percent idle time for physical disk is not less than 60% is simple because the results are returned as percentage by default. So that's super simple. It's very straightforward. So if I ran the query, that's what we would get. And the values we got are actually the percent idle time. Oh, we're not done. So if I run this command, and hey, no problem. Now some of these are not so straightforward. So validating the average time that the disk transfers took is another story because it returns seconds instead of milliseconds, and it's not uncommon to see the results in scientific notation when you multiply. And then you get an error in Pester and you can't figure out why until you actually drill down and look at the value. So if you don't know what scientific notation is, it's that. I didn't know what it was either. I'm like, what is that? But what you need to do if you have this problem is you actually need to cast it as a decimal. So it gets you around the problem. Do we have any questions? That's actually a good question, but I don't have a clue. I'm back to one of those, it would have made, to me, it would have made more sense just to do it in seconds instead of milliseconds. But maybe somebody somewhere must have requested it or thought it was important. But I think it goes back to one of those common sense things, is not that common anymore. One thing I did find out, and this is kind of a side note, just thought about it, is it sounds like get counter may work in PowerShell Core, and it was removed from a previous version because it was a really old version of the .NET Core. But then also another person in here told me that you might be able to use the Windows compatibility module and use implicit remoting to import it in without clobbering the other commandlets. So that's all stuff that it might be that the PowerShell team could revisit it and re-add it, or you could use the Windows compatibility module or a couple of options. So the physical disk average read time, Lars, does that answer your question? I mean, my answer I know doesn't answer it, but it's that I'm in the same boat you are, that I really don't know why they're so precise, I just want
to get things to be more usable.
Yeah. And really, this is just some of the pitfalls that you might run into because you write this test and you really don't see the value. You just see that it's not in the range you want it to be. And you're like, my system's not doing anything. Why is my Pester test failing? And then it's like, oh, well, it's in scientific notation. It's kind of like we have a box, you know, I'm a sand guy too, so we have like a framed architecture that we're working in instead of a frameless architecture. So to query these values, you can see I'm casting it as a decimal, so that's kind of the key to this one. So we're good on those. So it's milliseconds. And I think this was actually part of it as well. So this is the write. I normally would have run both these together, but we'll just run this one real quick. So the read and write is good. So determine if the memory is at least 10% available is kind of a problem because it gives you available bytes, but you need a percentage. So you have to figure out how much memory is in the box to be able to do the calculation. And if it's a remote system, that means you've got to use something like get sim instance with a sim session. And the Pester test will do all that for you. So it'll go ahead and grab it. You notice I'm using get sim instance there. And you might have been wondering earlier, let's see. There we go. You might have been wondering earlier why I was declaring this params as an empty array because, or an empty hash table, I guess. Because I copy and pasted the code from the actual function, and it takes care of that for me, but I had to go ahead and declare it so I didn't get an error. But that determines if somebody's using like a computer name parameter with the actual Pester test, and then it'll pick up those values, you know. Because really, a lot of people don't realize that, you know, I don't think anybody likes the backtick, and we use splatting for that, but it was actually designed for dynamically assigning parameters to commands. So the network card is the funnest one of all. So the network card, it gives you the bytes total a second, but you have to make sure that it's not more than 75% utilized. Yeah, so you got to figure out the link speed because if you've got 10 meg, 100 meg, gigabit, 10 gigabit, it can make a big difference. Because if you got 80 megs in use, then that's a big deal on 100 megabit. But if you got 10 gigs, hey, no problem. So we are going to run this. One of the benefits, like in a demo like this, of using the multi-line, because like here I've got a single line comment, but in the multi-line I can still select that line and I can actually still execute it, even though it's commented out. So I don't have to try to select just everything but the first character. It's a side note. So if you notice the format, so it's got pound symbol, or actually that's officially called, or a hash symbol, but really before all those new names came up, it's called an octothorpe. So when I query this though, notice it's got an underscore. And then depending on what name you're, or what machine you're on, and I'll just use zoom it to zoom in on this instead of, once I get what I want returned. What I want you to notice is this one has these square brackets. So guess what? You're back to a really fun regular expression to be able to compare these values. Also notice I wasn't lying earlier because I have all those different things installed that create all these virtual NICs. So, oh, I have one I forgot about. I actually have this PDA broadband adapter, so I can use my phone I can plug it in with USB and get on the internet with it if I had to. So tons of nicks, which creates lots of problems. Anyway. So if I queried I think I actually just ran this, so I can see the total bytes a second, which has got to be the line, but well, no, I'm on a VM, so it's an internal switch. So I'm not connected to the network. So you see the regular expression. I mean, it's not clean and fancy, but it does the job. So, hey. So we compared values. We made them look alike. So and all this says is if you're on a remote system, you've got to use like sim or something. You could also use invoke command to pull the results, but so I believe, yeah, I'm in the right folder. So first of all, we'll run all 10 performance counters against the local machine, and generally on this VM, the page file it says it's too much in use. So that's fine. It's a VM, who cares? But then I can define a sim session, and I can run the same thing against a remote machine like my domain controller. So everything's good on my domain controller. So that's all top 10 performance counters as defined by Microsoft, and it's within the acceptable range. And yes, all my tests will fail. Okay, bonus content. We actually did get to it. So you can export the performance counter information to a BLG file, which is a binary performance log file. So, and this is kind of the dumbest thing in the world. So I can export this. It lets me actually export it. Then guess what? And I'm going to show you the file exists. Everything's fine. We did all these performance counters on millions of systems. We have all the files. Well, then we think we have our baseline. Guess what? They don't work. The problem is that you have to have at least 2 samples to be able to import it. Although it will let you export it with 1 sample, it will not let you import it with 1 sample. Yeah.
Did that force flag allow you to export it with 1 sample? Or?
No, you can see I've got max samples here as 2. I'm using force because I've run the demo so many times to just overwrite the file, yeah. So now we have exported it, and now we have imported it. So this is a way you could do a baseline if you wanted to. It's probably not the best way to do it, but you could do this. So now let's go ahead and do this 10 times and create a file that we have some data to work with. So it should only take 10 seconds because it runs once per second. So what we can do, it's like, oh, we can't read a BLG file because it's a binary file. But we can actually, without looking at the data, we can immediately import the BLG file and convert it to a CSV. And then we can read the CSV. So, and let's say, well, I didn't really want a CSV, I wanted a TSV, a tab delimited file. Well, I can import the CSV or the BLG, either one, and convert it to a TSV file. Well then, let's try to, well, this will import it. So we do have data in it. But if I try to do get content on that file, yeah, good luck with that. But I can still use import counter, and I can look at this in Excel if I wanted to. So I can actually send it to somebody who can't do PowerShell, you know. But I can import the CSV, and there's all the data. And then I can import the tab delimited file, and I can import it as a CSV. And notice I had to use the escape sequence for the tab character, and you got to put it in single quotes there will not work. Trust me, I tried. Now, one thing you would think, okay, I got these 3 performance files, 3 different, the bad thing about doing things manually is everybody always does it different. So I exported one to a BLG, somebody did a CSV, and somebody did a TSV. Well, I'll just import them all. Well, no, you won't. Because you can't import different file types at the same time. So I thought I'd get smart and I'll pipe it to it. That won't work either. But what you can do, instead of doing it manually, you can just iterate through it with for each object, and you can import all 3 of them. And that actually did import all 3 of them, even though it went really fast. So these are all my performance counters. I kind of showed this earlier where you can store them in a variable. Well, actually, these are 9 of the 10 because this machine does not have Hyper-V, and one of the counters is Hyper-V. Because this is a VM, and I'm not doing nested virtualization. So now I'm going to query all 9 of the performance counters, and I'm going to put all those in a file instead of just the one I was doing earlier. And this should take 12 seconds. So I can import that data. It does have a timestamp. It flashed by, but like you get a timestamp, you get a bunch of results, you get a timestamp and a bunch of results. So maybe I just want to see 1 counter out of that file. I've got my performance, I've got my baseline, and I only want to see 1 counter out of the file. I don't want to see everything that just scrolled past the screen, so I can actually query the file and only get 1 performance counter. So then what I can do is, executives, when you go ask for money or something, they don't want to see text. They want to see a fancy GUI. Well, guess what? You can take that BLG file and you can open it in Performance Counter. So you can say, see, this is why I need money. Okay, so I grabbed the path with instances out of the file, and stored it in a variable. And what I want to do here is, so I know what's in the file. I have my baseline. I don't want to figure out what counters are in there. I want to query the file, get the counters, and then query a new one so I can compare them. So now I've done a new query of the same counters that already exist in the file. So because somebody else ran this file and I have no idea what counters are in there, but I want to make sure they're within an acceptable range. And also, when was this file created? So I can run a summary. So there's 12 sample counts, the oldest record, the newest record, because maybe you have this thing running every 60 minutes. And you've got these files floating around that you have no idea, somebody else created them. So we've got 5 minutes. And here what I tried to do is run like a directory on all the BLG files and then pipe it into get counter, or import counter, but that doesn't work. I want to revisit this job real quick. And we still have our job because, thankfully, VS Code has not crashed. That's why I actually have all the same code here so I could rerun it, but we don't need to rerun it. So we're going to try to export the results. And if you remember, let me just refresh your memory. So I have a deserialized object, but it's the right type of object. I would really like to save this to a file. Guess what? You get a cryptic error. It says it doesn't take pipeline input or it doesn't match any of the parameters. Now, if you use like parameter input, you get a little bit better error message. It says it cannot convert this type, and notice it starts with Microsoft, to type of deserialized. So it's actually two different types. So yeah, if you're going to run a job stored and you want it in a file, put it in a file in the job. So you could look at help for that, but you guys can do that later. So what if I ran this one here? I'm going to query the calendars on a machine, and I'm going to, on a remote machine, and store it locally. This will work. Well, I say it will work. It actually already exists, so I need the force parameter. Nope, not file format. So that will work, because we're kind of using the native capabilities. But what about running invoke command, which is how I prefer to run mine? It won't work. And it won't work because, of course, when you run invoke command, you get a deserialized object. So if you want to store it in a file, do it inside invoke command, which will end up a file on the remote system unless you use. If you try to put it on another system, then you run into the double hop problem. So, and I ran this one as parameter input. And it's the same thing, it just gives you the better error message. And so now we're to the summary. I do have a couple more slides, and we've just got a couple of minutes left. So I couldn't have timed this any better. So you've learned how to find performance bottlenecks on Windows-based systems with PowerShell. Like I said, Shift F5 is your friend in PowerPoint. Okay. So I have some resources. There's actually numerous articles on the internet. Jeff Hicks has written a number of performance counter related articles on the Altero blogs, and they're really good. The Format Mister counter that I showed you earlier was actually based on one of the Iron Scripter events, the very first one, like the prequels. So I'd been working with performance counters, and I'm like, that's a great idea. So that's kind of how I came up with that idea. And then I told you about the PowerShell conference book already. And then that's my contact slide. So my email is encoded on my About page. So go see if you can decode it and send me an email. That's a challenge. I like challenges. Those are all the book projects I've taken part of. I'm a big believer in personal branding, so pretty much mic up Robbins everywhere. I sign up for things even if I never use them, just to get the brand. Any questions? Thank you guys for attending my session.